Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And we have not looked at Burma for some time on the channel. So we will round off the end of 2024 with a look at the end of 1944 and what was playing out in the campaign during that year, and the events and how much we are still talking about them or not talking about them. My guests, John McManus, Rob Lyman, and Jack Bowsher, join me for a chat. I'll bring them in now. Good afternoon and evening, gentlemen. I trust we're all well. So we're not going to do a big, long preamble about who you all are. Everyone knows who you all are, and your books are linked in the description below. But let's start with John, because the Burma campaign often thought of as being primarily British and the Commonwealth forces, but of course the Americans do have quite a big say in it. So give us a sort of summary of what the US his role is in the Burma campaign at the beginning of 1944, with of course some mention of Stilwell and the Chinese. So John.
Yeah, absolutely. So really for the Americans, Burma is a necessary evil because of the vital importance of keeping China in the war, for lack of a better way to put it. That's the Americans thought of it. And actually, to me, it's kind of interesting that we would look at it that way, because China is the reason we are in this war. The United States had been, of course, heavily involved in China in the infamous open door, had wanted a balance of power on the Asian continent. This had really brought it into conflict with an rising imperial Japan, which is, of course, heavily involved in China. And so this has brought us to the war. And of course, the Japanese, in attacking the Western powers, had embraced a two-front war, one in China and one in the Pacific. And so the idea is, since China is mostly cut off from the outside world, once we have the North Burma campaign, that's a disaster in 1942 for all of us, the idea is you've got to keep them supplied, and you've got to sustain their armies somehow so they can tie down what is probably about, anywhere from 50 to 70% of the Imperial Japanese Army at any given time in this war, So the necessity for that, obviously, is North Burma, which is sort of the weaker point of the Japanese control of the country, and, of course, its entry point to India. So from the U.S. perspective, the whole idea is to sustain that logistical line initially through the air, the famous flying the hump and all that. But ultimately, we envision by the time 1944 starts, we want a landward link to China, and that's what this whole thing is about. From the main American involvement in North Burma at that point is on the engineering side,
right?
In building that road, which is just such an enormous undertaking. And I'd point out that about 2/3 of the U.S. soldiers who are in play there are African Americans, serving in segregated engineer units deep in the wilds, building a road out of, basically nothingness, alongside the British, alongside Indian, alongside hired laborers. It's a diverse group of folks. So in the meantime, the ranking American commander in theater, what the Americans had called CBI, China, Burma, India, is, of course, Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell, who is all at once perfect for this job and the worst person for this job. And that's what's so fascinating about him, because I say he's perfect because he'd spent a lot of time in China and he knew the culture reasonably well. He spoke passable Chinese. He could read Chinese. He loved the Chinese people. And so he had a great passion for this mission. He's the worst on some levels because he's so preternaturally honest that he can't stand the despotism and corruption of Chiang Kai-shek's regime. And this becomes, of course, counterproductive. So there already been that tension. And in fact, Chiang Kai-shek wanted Stilwell out by the fall of 43, by October. So this has all happened prior to the time period we're focusing on tonight. He'd wanted him out, but still had survived, ironically enough, because of some sort of back channel work by Chiang Kai-shek's wife, Mai Ling-soon, who's a fascinating figure in her own right. So Stilwell's main preoccupation as 1944 unfolds is in continuing that North Burma campaign, capturing what the Americans, a city the Americans called Michinar. We could call it Mietkina. I mean, I've seen a lot of different pronunciations, but bottom line, we figure we have to have that to build the road deeper, to connect into China. And he's finally received some American combat troops for that purpose, the better part of an infantry regiment that we call Merrill's Marauders. So he'd been basically involved in China itself through the prior year and a half or so. Now he's going to get very interested in being on the ground in Burma and supervising those operations alongside the Chinese, who have donated 2 divisions for this purpose, the 22nd and 38th, that the Americans have helped train. So it's a really kind of interesting dynamic that we've got there.
Okay, well, thanks for that, John. So let's bring Rob in now. So Rob, if that's the American sort of ambitions and intentions going into 44, what are those of the British and the wider Commonwealth countries?
Well, right at the top, in terms of our strategic ambitions, both the Americans and the British had an ongoing dialogue through 1943, determining how best to support Chiang Kai-shek. And as John quite correctly says, the Roosevelt-led ambition was for the Americans to keep supporting China. Britain came along reluctantly. There's a lot of debate at the time and subsequently about how really worthwhile it was to keep China in the war. I hear this argument about perhaps there being up to 1 million Japanese troops in China, and that's absolutely right. It was important to keep China occupied and on the Allied side. But Chiang Kai-shek was fighting a number of enemies, not just the Japanese. He was also fighting the Chinese up in the northwest of the country. He was also fighting to keep his own alliance, the Kuomintang, alive, and that was very difficult. And so fighting the Japanese wasn't his only ambition. And the Americans recognized this, to be fair, through 1940, late 42, 43. And you can see it in all the correspondence in Washington about the support to China. But in terms of what's happening at the end of 1943, by the way, in the end of 1943, Stilwell, quite an extraordinary character, decides unilaterally to be against orders to begin his advance over the Pak Toi Ranges from Lido to start building the Lido Road. No, the Lido Road has started to be built, but he sent his first 3,000 troops down it. At the same time, the Allies in northeastern India are preparing for a Japanese invasion of India. Now, they knew this by December 1943 because they'd broken the Japanese codes. In fact, the Americans had broken the Japanese codes. Japanese didn't actually transmit a huge amount electronically, but sufficient was known that the Japanese were planning to arrive in India in March. Now, through 1943, the Allies, that's essentially the British Army and the Indian Army in eastern India, had been preparing to advance into Burma itself. And this was part of the agreement with Chiang Kai-shek. So in 1943, the arrangement had been, there was a huge amount of argument. He's a very difficult man to tie down, Chiang Kai-shek, but he was demanding boots on the ground in Burma. And an agreement had been reached that Stilwell's Northern Combat Area Command would advance down the Lido Road towards Myitkyina. And by the way, John, it is Myitkyina. I've been there a number of times. The local Kachin people call it Myitkyina. I've always described it as the way to say Myitkyina is think of Kitchener, and you'll get it right. But very interesting that Chiang Kai-shek arranged for his Yunnan force to come in, Y force to come in from the east, and the British would provide a 2-division advance across the Chinwin towards Mandalay. So you could see the whole idea about 1944 is there'd be an American advance from the top, Chinese from the east, and British and Indian from the west. And the idea of 1944 was that these forces would congregate in Upper Burma, as it was described then, and secure Upper Burma from the Japanese. Why? Because remember this, as John said at the outset, Burma was only of interest to the Japanese because of what was known as the Burma Road, what began as the road from Rangoon to Mandalay to Lashio to Chongqing, that had been seized by the Japanese in early 1942. By May 1942, the whole of Burma was in Japanese hands. And the Americans, this is American chutzpah, engineering expertise and power. By the way, let's just be really clear at the start. There were 272,000 American servicemen in India in 1944. How many Brits were there? There were 100,000. There were nearly 3 times as many Americans fighting in Burma, doing everything that was necessary to sustain Allied strategy as there were Brits. And, we think, you said right at the start, we think of this as a British campaign. It wasn't a British campaign. It was a truly Allied campaign with every country under the sun fighting from late 1944 under the aegis of 1943 rather, under the aegis of Lord Louis Mountbatten, who was the Supremo. So the idea was that whilst a road was being built down to Michenar from Lido, the amazing, absolutely amazing Hump airlift. I mean, we need to talk about this, John, because the Hump airlift, at the time was one of the greatest logistical efforts ever undertaken. It was undertaken with pilots who hardly knew how to fly. Navigators hadn't been trained. They were living in terrible situations on basically plowed airfields in northeastern Assam and up the upper Brahmaputra, 8 of them, in fact. It was a terrible, terrible flight. 3 hours, 3.5 hours into Chongqing and 4 hours back over the most horrendous terrain. There were something like 500 aircraft lost over the aluminum trail, as Americans like to call it. Really quite an extraordinary effort in order to keep supplies flying, going into China. So that's the imperative for the Lido Road. Once the Lido Road had been built, then the Hump airlift would be lifted. So that's what's happening. That's the whole context of late 1943, early 1944 in Burma, in order to free up Upper Burma from the Japanese and to enable supplies to keep on flowing to support the Chinese.
Brilliant stuff, Rob. So let's bring in Jack now. Been sitting there patiently. So we often define any of the campaigns in World War II by the key battles. Maybe Burma isn't the best one to judge by battles. It's maybe in terms of regions or campaigns, but to sort of get the ball rolling, because we can't talk about everything today. In terms of those key battles in 1944, you write primarily about armor, and I should point out that you and Rob are launching your own Forgotten War Burma podcast in February, so make sure you sign up for that, for social media announcements about that, and but we'll get that plug in now. But Jack, should we be defining Burma by specific battles, or is it more looking at campaigns, or is it, as John and Rob have already said, more a matter of kind of engineering and logistics, all those side of things? Bring us into the conversation.
I mean, the boring answer there is that it actually has to be a mixture of all of those things together.
Good historian's answer there. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah,
that wasn't Jack Bowsher.
But no. So the thing is, we use battles, don't we? Because it's such an easy framework to create drama around these things, and that's a very big difference, I suppose, between where I enter the group chat essentially here. Is I am less academic than my two peers here. I'm coming here really as I think the boots on the ground type of level. I think is where we're going. So, the big things that are happening here is that after the big failures of 1943, you're coming into 1944, where the plan is to strike back. The Allies are preparing their various advances, and you've mentioned regions, the areas that we're going to be heading for. So there's the Arakan, which is the coastal region. Sort of, if you were looking at a map of Burma, that's the coast on the Bay of Bengal in the bottom left-hand corner of Burma. Yes, there you go. This is where the Arakan, geographically, it's one of the wettest places on the planet. It has a particularly vicious monsoon season, for example. And this is where the Allies are choosing not to make their attack because they want to advance from Imphal further to the north. And essentially, the Imphal plain is being designed as the launching off point for what will be a new campaign to reconquer Burma in 1944, as well as obviously with the Northern Combat Area Command launching themselves at Michenar as well, through again another very heavily jungled, very, very difficult area further to the north of Imphal as well. And essentially this is about trying to put pressure on as many different places as possible. The trouble is the Japanese essentially beat the Allied effort to the punch. Now they know that the Japanese are planning something, and this is one of the things at the end of 1943 that begins to make a difference to the planning. But it does mean that the Allies are not in the place that they expect to be when the first Japanese efforts fall. And so this is where you get the Battle of the Admin Box in February, which is intended as a distraction from the main Japanese effort that will be taking place aimed at Imphal, that is supposed to get up into the Brahmaputra Valley and eventually ignite an Indian nationalist uprising. Hopefully, that's the intention, at least. And so that's essentially how the 1944 will play out. And then finally, once the outcome of those battles, again, I'm sure we'll talk about the specifics of this, it will then become a chase back towards Burma, and it sets up the reconquest campaign of 1945.
You've made me think about something there, Jack. When we were back in sort of August and September, we were talking about the ETO on the channel. We were talking about the ETO in 1944. Is it being a question of destroying the enemy? Is it about capturing ground, or is it a question of kind of liberating peoples who have been occupied? Is that a fair way of looking at the Burma campaign? Obviously, it's not so much about liberating peoples as such, but is it about defeating the Japanese at this point in 1944, or is it about retaking the area? John, how would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, I think it's all about China. I mean, I really do. I mean, China, it's hard for me to articulate this. China occupies such a small place for us historiographically, I guess, in our memory of the war. And I think this is very true in the U.S. And yet I think you could argue it is absolutely central to every element of World War II, and especially from a U.S. perspective in the war against Japan. But beyond that, I mean, though China was perceived as a in the CBI, as we called it, a kind of a backwater theater, really it's kind of front and center in terms of the long-term importance of this. And so here's what I mean by that. The Americans are constantly telling Chiang Kai-shek, you're important to us, you're equal status with our other allies. They of course have just sat down with Chiang Kai-shek at the Cairo conference in I think August 1943, the British and the Chinese and the Americans. And this is a very big deal from a Chinese standpoint after the so-called century of humiliation and of kind of imperial domination, And so the Americans are constantly striving to have China afforded this great power status, and constantly telling Chiang Kai-shek, you're so important to us. And yet when it comes to make global geostrategic decisions, the resources, the priority goes somewhere else. And a classic example is at the Cairo conference, they promise Chiang Kai-shek that there are going to be amphibious operations. I think it's called Operation Buccaneer in southern Burma and whatnot. And of course, eventually we have to backpedal from that because we realize we don't have enough landing craft and other shipping in order to do that. And then Normandy and all the other stuff that we've got on the board. And then we subsequently meet at the Tehran conference with the Soviet Union. And of course, they're going to get priority in the end. We all know that. So Chiang Kai-shek is operating in this kind of dynamic where the Americans are telling him one thing and kind of doing another. And so he's a bit in a bad mood about this as we enter 1944. And we can kind of understand that. So what I guess the point I've made is that though it's understandable, if we've earmarked a kind of lower status in terms of priority for him and for China in this war, it probably equates to the fact that we're going to have less influence on whatever the outcome is in China. Rob mentioned that he's really worried about the long-term situation beyond the Japanese because obviously he has this mortal enemy, the communists there. And we think, well, this is just like working with communists in Europe or, like communists in the French resistance movement or whatever. We worry about those ideological issues later. No, this is an existential threat to the nationalist regime. And Chiang Kai-shek certainly understands this. He's got a lot of problems he's juggling, in addition, by the way, to another Chinese regime that's in play that we think of as a puppet regime that is in Japanese-occupied China, but views itself as the legitimate China, like the Vichy French in a way. It's so crazy. So if we are affording a lower priority, it means we're going to have less influence on the outcome, as I see it. And I think when we look at it today and we think about the People's Republic of China, we think about our situation now, we think about the Cold War and the U.S. fighting two major wars on the Asian continent, in Korea and Vietnam, because of the communist victory. I mean, all of this is really a byproduct of our failed policy during World War II. That is a product of our larger kind of global geostrategic stresses in which we've had to make these really difficult decisions. So I would argue the whole thing is central to China, and especially from like the American perspective, I guess.
Well, I think it's time to bring Rob in on that because,
Well, also the British perspective, because John, you're absolutely right. I give a lecture at university on this, and the lecture's called "It's All About China," and it is absolutely the entire war in the Far East is about China. The reason why the Japanese invade Burma was because of China. The reason why Britain and the Commonwealth, the Empire, fight the Japanese in Burma was because of the Chinese. It was never British policy, despite American wags calling Southeast Asia Command save England's Asian colonies. It was never the ambition to re-enter Burma and to conquer Burma. Burma was always seen as a stepping stone to recapturing Singapore. It was always about China. And you bring in Operation Buccaneer, which is a classic example of the challenge of trying to create allied strategy with, and Buccaneer was against the Andaman Islands, by the way. Again, a stepping stone. It was a stepping stone possibly to reconquer Burma, but actually, in Churchill's eye, this was to get back to Singapore, Andaman Islands, those islands and the Indian Islands and the Bay of Bengal. And of course, that couldn't happen because of the pressure on amphibious equipment and so on. But the real challenge, I think, with Buccaneer was the fact that Roosevelt and Churchill felt, and the Chiefs of Staff, the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Combined Chiefs of Staff felt obliged to present something like Buccaneer to get Chiang Kai-shek moving, trying to persuade him. Buccaneer was a bribe. You come and help us in Burma by training your troops, by not diverting the resources we give you, your fuel and ammunition and everything else, to fighting the communists or storing them up. Remember, throughout all of this, this got Churchill very, very angry at one stage in mid-1943. Chiang Kai-shek had large numbers of troops on the Tibetan border. He wasn't deploying all his resources to fight the Japanese. So part of the pressure, part of the bribe with Chiang Kai-shek was, you take your training seriously and we'll commit to Buccaneer and all the rest of it. Ultimately, Buccaneer wasn't possible. And actually, the whole story of the conversation, the strategic conversation with China, was just to keep China going. And actually, very interestingly enough, about a month after Buccaneer was cancelled, Chiang Kai-shek said, "All right, we'll commit to supporting your operations down the Lido Road and into Upper Burma anyway." So it was a little bit of bluff on the behalf of Chiang Kai-shek, but it's absolutely clear. Your question to Jack a little while ago, and Jack answered correctly, battles clearly important, but actually everything is driven by this strategic conversation. What do we do about China? And there's no doubt about it. In 1944, the focus on putting troops in the field in Burma was a consequence of trying to satisfy American concerns that Britain wasn't being strong enough to support. To give you a little example of this, so I'd already mentioned this, the Yunnan force, the Chinese coming in from the east and the British coming in from Manipur, 2 divisions, and still coming down from the north, down the Hawken Valley, where the Lido Road is being built. Those operations were a function of an exchange that took place in 1943 between Roosevelt and Churchill. Roosevelt said, Britain, he said to Winston Churchill, prove to me that you're going to support our policy to put boots on the ground in Burma to satisfy Chiang Kai-shek. It just so happened that in 1943, this maverick general called Ord Wingate turned up with the first expedition called Operation Longcloth. Churchill grabbed Longcloth. It was a bit of a failure, but he grabbed Longcloth and he said, I've got a guy here who can demonstrate that we can fight the Japanese and win battles successfully in Burma. And I commit to sending this guy, let's call him the Chindits, back into Burma in 1944 to do this. And Churchill was presenting this offer to Roosevelt in order to persuade Roosevelt to support his Mediterranean strategy, i.e., let's put our efforts into the Italian underbelly whilst we wait for D-Day in Normandy in 1944. And so there is a strategic exchange going on here. It's not about Burma. It's all about an agreement between Roosevelt and Churchill in 1943 about supporting each other's strategies. And as a consequence of Roosevelt agreeing to the Mediterranean strategy, we put troops into Burma in 1944, we, the Allies. I mean, that's as simple as it gets. It's not about the need to defeat the Japanese. It's about meeting the needs of strategy. And too often, military historians ignore the strategic dimension to war, to our peril, because you can't understand war simply by describing the stories of the battles. It might be exciting and dramatic and dynamic and really interesting and all that sort of stuff. And we get the material impact of war. We get all that fabulous stuff about the human experience of war and the human dimension of war. But actually, we don't understand why it happened in the first place. That's where I come from.
Wow, 24 minutes and I've had my first head explosion moment. But so I've written down here that we are going to talk about the key battles of 1944, but maybe we should talk about the key moments of 1944. But the fact is, for a lot of people watching this today and who'll be watching it later, Imphal, Kohima, the Merrill's Marauders at Myitkyina, Chindit operations, they're going to be people's starting point. It's like Arnhem is a starting point for airborne in the ETO or whatever it would be, or the 8th Air Force is people's first port of call when it talks about strategic bombing. So we are caught in that. That's the world we exist. Kohima, Imphal, the admin box that Jack brought up, they're integral to our understanding and our ongoing interest in the theatre. But Jack, bringing it back to you, because you hadn't had a chance to say anything for a while because everyone's being so brilliant, but your chance to be brilliant. What are the key moments of 44 from your point of view? You are an unashamed kind of boots on ground kind of guy. So what are the key moments from your point of view?
Yeah, do you know, there was one other thing I was going to add as well. Just John, I found your point fascinating as well. Just I think the other thing that America tying itself to the China strategy is it helps legitimize the US war effort in the first place. You know, because there is no Pearl Harbor if America is not involved in China, and so therefore America is not involved in the war. So they have to kind of stick themselves. You know, they have to support the Chinese from that regard as well. But yeah, so those key moments, you essentially, like I mentioned earlier, the British and Allies and the Indian Army are planning their invasion of India from the supply base at Imphal that they've been building up in the second half of 1943. And also that second half of 1943 is where the really big changes that Slim makes to things like the training regime. You know, this is the point when, the soldiers are taught to make the jungle their friend. This is the point when, from my point of view as well, the armoured training takes place as well. And all of these forces are moving forward to the Imphal plain. The reason why there are troops or reasonable numbers of troops on the Imphal plain is because they are preparing for their invasion. But the Japanese obviously strike first. They make their attempt to distract Slim at the admin box. And what's happening there is they are hoping that they're going to bring, that Slim is going to send reinforcements from Imphal and send them down to the Arakan. That will therefore lead to a weakened Imphal, and then a month later, when the Japanese launch their invasion of India, that will therefore come into a relatively empty Imphal plain. They're going to pack super light, 20 days worth of food and supplies. They'll capture the Churchill rations, the British supply bases at Imphal, and also make their way to the really big supply base at Dimapur, which is the railhead. And that's when they get caught up, essentially, at Kohima. Sato is the commander of the Japanese forces that are heading that way. And then they just get sucked into a battle that, realistically actually is not strategically what they're after. They get pulled into the Kohima battle, I think really because Sato wants to have that victory. He's engaged in a combat there that he can't then withdraw, the code of Bushido and so on. He has to finish that battle before he goes on to Dimapur, when actually Dimapur was there for the taking. And that would have had a much bigger strategic impact if they'd actually managed to do that.
Brilliant stuff, Jack. You were saying something there about the training regime, and I want to bring John and Robin on this, because one of the things I think we can't overlook with this theatre is just the drain of non-battle casualties, just malaria and all those things, then dealing with just the shittiness of fighting in that theatre. But was 1944 perhaps the first year where the Allies are beginning to master the domain, having been clearly outclassed a couple of years earlier? From the American point of view of things, you mentioned the Merrill's Marauders, Rob, you mentioned Wingate and the Chindits there. Was that something that everybody was conscious of going into 44, that this is the year we will master this type of warfare? John, what's your feeling?
I mean, I don't think they ever really master it. I think they learn how to exist in it. Right. Just as a base point, in 1943 in the South Pacific, in MacArthur's theater, we were losing about 4 soldiers to disease for everyone in combat against the Japanese. And it's not going to be too much different when we have Merrill's Marauders campaign in Northern Burma in 1944. Sickness is really, on some levels, the bigger threat to you than Japanese ordnance, even, in terms of evacuation, getting hit and being evacuated. Not necessarily fatalities, I suppose, but obviously it's an impediment to operating in theater. To this stage, from the point of view of U.S. forces in India and Burma, almost everything has been all about feeding that aerial logistical lifeline, which Rob described so well, of flying the hump, getting into China. Now it's transitioning a bit because the road is far enough that we can now envision perhaps getting to Myitkyina and capturing it, and this creates a kind of a new phase for the whole land link to China thing. That's going to take some pretty heavy fighting alongside those two Chinese divisions, and the original concept is that our operations will be kind of coordinated with Wingate's, I guess, but Wingate had hoped to, and I think had this sort of vision of all of us together in one unit under his control, and still it was very clear once he gets U.S. ground combat troops, they're going to be under Stilwell's control. Wingate has this moment where he says, "You can tell General Stilwell to stick his Americans up his ass." That kind of, I love it. It's so Wingate, and it's so Stilwell too. And
Wingate and Stilwell together, what a really bad mix.
Exactly. And what a fun mix for us as historians, don't you think? I mean, it's like, so I mean, Stilwell's gonna have his hands on that, isn't he? So it's an infantry regiment, and the interesting thing about it, it's been recruited from like all over the world on some levels. Guys have come from Trinidad. Guys have come from the States. They've come from the South Pacific. It's from people in theater who were dumb enough to volunteer or whatever. Many of them were in places serving that were so dead end, especially like in Trinidad, that it was like, I'm doing anything to get out of here. Like the VD rates at one of the regiments that they came from are like 75% and upward, so they wanted something else. And when they get in theater, they get a lot of this really hardcore refresher training that only Wingate really, I think, can do on some levels. So I think, and they get this weird name, the 5307th Composite Unit, which one guy quipped that it sounded more like an address in LA than a combat unit. So eventually, we go with Merrill's Marauders, but also there's the code name for them, Galahad. Sometimes they're called that. And it's a regiment of 3,000 plus, very, very well-trained light infantrymen who are going to be working alongside tribesmen from Northern Burma who are working with the OSS under an officer named Lieutenant Colonel, I think Colonel William Piers, who will one day be a general. He actually will be the general who investigates the My Lai massacre during the Vietnam War. But in this war, he's working with locals, many of whom hate the Japanese in Northern Burma because of how they've operated there. So it's very much a kind of a hand-to-mouth operation because it's so hard to supply once you plunge deep into the jungle there. So it's this is unique in the sense that Stilwell has gotten these guys in theater, and he's not going to get much more. And so he is going to have to ride these guys till they're done. And that's
I agree. I think that's a really good way of putting it. Merrill's Marauders are always they're an interesting subject, of course. And of course, when those people John describes were recruited into the composite force, they were recruited on the basis of a tough assignment. I forget the exact phrase, but they knew what they were getting into. But what they had no idea about is where they would be operating, which is the Hawken Valley, which is one of the remotest parts of the world. In fact, within a month of those 3,000 men setting out from Lido, I was in Lido only a couple of weeks ago, but only about a month after they set out at the end of 1943, they'd already lost 300 men to sickness. They were walking down the Lido Road towards their first engagement. But extraordinarily, this is early 1944, they had no idea, and Stilwell had no idea about the nature of the opposition. He was being faced by the bulk of what was the 18th Chrysanthemum Division in northern Burma. And they had an entire regiment, so a brigade. The Japanese had 3,000 men right at the top of the Hawken Valley. And dear me, Merrill's Marauders had a really tough time in the first month of their engagement. But it's very interesting. Merrill's Marauders. Merrill himself was an interesting guy. He was in his late 30s. He'd never had any real combat experience. He was quite ill. He was out of combat for a long time. He looked the part. He was a nice guy. He chatted to everyone and people liked him, but he had no combat experience whatsoever. And I think John's right. The training that Merrill's Marauders had by Wingate and Ramgarh in India actually was pretty effective. I mean, some of the Americans saying this is hell on earth. I mean, how on earth are we supposed to cope with this? Well, they were very grateful thereafter for having that training. The other thing we need to bear in mind here is, of course, although Stilwell inexplicably had no idea where the Chrysanthemum Division was. And I've spent a lot of time with a colleague in Japan and the Japanese War College actually mapping out the Chrysanthemum Division. We had very little hard intelligence on the ground. And John's mentioned the Kachins. This is Kachin territory. The Japanese had been very, very ruthless with the Kachins in 1942, early 43, because they were known to be supportive of the British. And they had raped villages, they had burnt them down, they'd killed lots of Kachin people, and they'd forced the Kachins onto the Allied side. So the Merrill's marauders, their most fervent disciples and supporters were Kachin members of that detachment that Pearce had created, 101 detachment. But the other thing we need to remember is that Stilwell had, of course, been training up 30,000 Chinese as well through this period. And if the big challenge in 1942 was untrained troops, it was a challenge for the Indian Army, it was a challenge for the British Army. The Americans were getting stuck in earlier than we in India were. I mean, the Americans were engaging the Japanese at Guadalcanal at the end of 1942. We weren't really engaged. Well, we were engaged at Arakan at the same time, but it was a complete disaster. But think about the Chinese. Those Chinese recruits, many of them had been part of the Chinese Expeditionary Force to Burma in 1942, but many weren't. Many were brand new recruits. Now, do you know how the Chinese recruited their troops? They basically sent squads into villages. They put a cordon around a village. They would then go into the village and tell all the young men to drop their trousers. And if they had pubic hair, they were caught and they were conscripted immediately. They were taken to one of the airfields at Kunming. Wow. And they were put on a plane. They had no idea where they're going. They'd never been on a plane before. There's one terrible story of these young Chinese conscripts going off to India to be trained, paid for by Britain, by the way, and trained by British soldiers. But they're on a C-47. They'd never flown before. They'd never seen an aircraft before. They all panicked. They all rushed to the back of the aircraft and the plane then crashed and they're all killed. I mean, the stories of 1943 and 1944 Chinese training the Chinese are extraordinary, and we know nothing about them. I just need to actually pop in here my colleague Rana Mitter's book of China's War. Brings a lot of this out. It's one of the few books that really focus on what China was doing at the time. We're having this conversation today, great conversation, but we are looking at it from a Western perspective mainly. And what we do need to do is jump into Chinese shoes and understand what they were going through. And Rana does it really, really well in his book. But so, it's a matter, yes, you asked Jack about the training situation. 1943 was the point at which the entire Indian Army was rebuilt. And it's really quite an extraordinary story. Much of it told by American historians, in fact. The reality is that Indian troops, civilians were recruited, they were trained, they spent 9 months doing basic infantry training, they then did 2 further months of jungle training, so 11 months training. It's quite an extraordinary amount of time, 1943. So by 1944, the time we're talking about now, the Indian troops, actually found fighting the Japanese relatively easy. I mean, there are lots of memoirs of Indian soldiers saying, killing the Japanese is not too difficult. They keep on rushing at us and we just have to aim straight and we get them. And it's largely the same with the Chinese going down the Lido Road as well.
All right. Both of you said, all of you said things I want to bring in, but I want to bring in John now. So you talked about the hand to mouth kind of existence. And when you've been on the channel talking about, for example, Italy or Normandy, and we're talking about 1944 elsewhere, the Allies have essentially plenty of assets, maybe not quite as much as they would really want, but they can do multiple things at the same time. That never really gets solved in the Burma theater, does it? I mean, Rob talked brilliantly about the flying the hump and the incredible resources put into that. But if you're an infantryman, or we'll bring in Jack later, a tanker in 44, yes, you were better trained, Rob, and you've all said that, but your lot, you didn't feel necessarily on the ground in the jungle that you were part of a much more advanced, technologically superior force than you had been 2 years ago. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, it is a different dynamic. I think, but the one thing that I think is similar, especially like the European theater, once we're into the end of the summer of 44 and onward, the material is sometimes in theater, but the hard part is getting it to the people who need it right at the spear point. So if we've got that problem in a highly developed area of the world, imagine here. I mean, a lot of these supplies obviously are going to be landed in Indian ports and whatnot, and they have to get on some pretty questionable railroads to get even, front staged. And then the harder part then is getting that to the columns, because it's basically columns operating deep in the jungle. On whatever trails we have, and the Kachins are doing the guiding. And so how are we really supplying people? It's mainly by air. So really, if there are, I know that the Merrill's Marauders guys on the ground pay the ultimate price for all this in terms of disease, privation, fighting some pretty hard, sharp engagements against an excellent division, really, in a way. And so, yeah, there's that. But if there's unsung heroes in this campaign, it's the aviators who really do a pretty amazing job of front supplying these guys and evacuating wounded and sick people, improvising, landing small aircraft in whatever clearings there are to evacuate people. All that is done pretty well. And the coordination between the ground unit and the Army Air Forces, I think, is done very, very well. I think you also see a lot of lessons learned here in northern Burma that are going to be applied in the Philippines, and on Leyte, on Luzon, other places, in terms of supplying units that are, in terms of a direct line of communication on the ground, out of contact with higher headquarters and larger logistical nodes that are behind us. So yeah, if you're one of those Merrill's Marauders guys, say in March 1944, you're probably looking at 1 K ration a day. Your medical supplies, not a whole lot there. Water is a problem. And purifying the water is a serious issue at times. Yep. And obviously your malaria pills. So there's a lot to worry about, and maintaining your animals, because basically that's how we're moving stuff, not really by vehicles, but by mules. And that's as old as the Army itself on many levels. So, and of course, on top of it, in terms of significant battles, we have Nupunga, which sees basically one of the battalions. There are 3 battalions roughly, and one of them is surrounded and cut off for a period of several days and has to be partially resupplied by the air, but the others have to fight their way to them. And it is quite a struggle that goes on there. So you can imagine, if you're one of these guys, how challenging your supply issue is going to be. But the aviators are so skilled that not only they're dropping enough food, I guess, to sustain these guys at a basic level, and enough medical supplies, but they're dropping in books too. Believe it or not, some of which were in French. They're dropping in books, and also care package items from the United States too. And so it's really an interesting mix, Woody, because it's like, it is very much a point of the spear, hand to mouth operation for those who really experience it. And yet it's quite sophisticated on some levels too, in order just to have any operations in this kind of remote area. And also from the Japanese perspective, we really end up ahead of them because they don't really have enough to counter this. So by the time we're into the siege of Michinar by late summer 1944, now the Japanese are really on the end of that logistical totem pole, and this is going to cost them pretty big time.
So I want to bring in Jack here now, because Rob.
No, I was just going to say I love hearing John. John's reminded me of Jack Masters, one of his marvelous books, where he described coming under American air supply for the first time, the Chindits, Operation Thursday, and receiving all the standard American stuff. He said they just didn't know what to do with it. There was everything. They had clothes, they had K rations. By the way, K ration only gave you 3,000 calories a day. It was nothing like what was required. You needed at least, if you're tromping over northern Burma, you need at least 6,000 calories a day. But it's fascinating. The American air effort was an extraordinary characteristic of the operation. Right, Jack.
No, Jack, I want to bring Jack in because we talked about the lack of the kind of assets that would be normal in ETO, massed artillery, close air support, and intelligence. I think you mentioned intelligence yourself 15 minutes or so ago, Jack. But those assets you don't have to the same extent in the Burma theatre. But again, as our boots on the ground guy, not that John and Rob are not equally competent at that, what does start to make the difference for the Allies on the ground in 1944 in terms of winning battles?
I mean, the first thing to just say as well is on the aerial resupply front is it's not just the supply side of things. It is also the petrol and lubricants, the oil. It's also the ammunition for artillery and tanks and so on. You know, at Mountbatten in August 1944, he even orders experiments to be made for Dakotas to take broken down Shermans to see if they can actually fly Shermans and then assemble them at a forward airfield. Which doesn't come to anything, mostly because they can't have that many people working on the airfields and feed them, supply them, and protect them in the forward area at one of these airfields. So it doesn't come to anything. But it shows you the levels that they are considering using air power to. And also, you know, as the 5th Division are chasing the Japanese out of the Imphal Plain and down the Tidim Road to the south towards the crossing of the Chindwin River, Malcolm Connolly is one of the tank drivers in the 3rd Carabiniers. They actually stop at the side of the road. They have an engine for his Lee tank dropped by parachute. Wow. They change it that evening, and then they go up Kennedy Peak, which is 5,000 feet off the valley floor and 8,900 feet off of sea level. This is the insane level of the extremes that they will go to in aerial resupply.
Brilliant stuff. So, Rob, I want to bring in John a bit more because we're losing John in about 14 minutes or so. So one of the things we're going to discuss is how the events of 1944 influenced Allied planning for 1945 and how much then kind of got thrown out the window because the things go differently in 1945. So I know we're kind of skipping ahead a bit. We still haven't necessarily talked about all the things we want to talk about in 44. But John, as we get towards this time 80 years ago, what are the American hopes and dreams, if you like, for moving into 1945? Has 44 gone to plan?
I don't know if it's gone entirely to plan, but there has been progress, and but a lot's happened too. I mean, of course, the Merrill's Marauders campaign, which is the most famous aspect of this, has stretched roughly from latter part of February and March into the early fall. From that phase into the fall of Myitkyina, then you're going to have some level of reinforcements come, another infantry regiment. You're going to have engineers that have been cannibalized, and all of this business too. And the idea is, all right, we're going to follow up on this. And we're going to ultimately, advance through Eastern Burma and link that up with the road coming from Western China. And we're finally going to have our landward link. Now, we will have that, by, I think it's, March 1945. We're going to have that, but we've had another land campaign in the meantime, which is a little bit better supplied. But also another thing that's happened is a pretty big deal. Stillwell's gone. And Stillwell's crowning moment, of course, comes when he gets... initially when it gets the airfield of Myitkyina, in May, but this then unfortunately devolves into a siege that goes on through the rest of the summer until you finally get the town itself and the road junction and all that great stuff. So Stillwell's kind of full of himself on some level that he's finally fulfilled this object. He is overseeing American soldiers. He's really been there at or near the front through a lot of this whole thing. And it's admirable, but also it was very frustrating, I think, for Chiang Kai-shek and for the Chinese and some people at higher levels who felt that he was inaccessible and getting too deep into the tactical weeds. So at this stage, just to kind of summarize, the larger concern, and I think Robert alluded to this earlier, is the quality of the Chinese army and whether they're going to fight to our satisfaction and really put a dent into the Japanese. This is a point of frustration that's gone on for years by now. And so there's some talk that Chiang Kai-shek will reform his army and retrain it to some level. Stillwell has a whole plan on how to do that. He wants to basically clear out a lot of the dross, the useless guys who are corrupt and have been impressed and, all this other stuff we've discussed, into having a real army that's really trained and well run and well supplied with American advisors and all that. So Chiang Kai-shek is actually considering considering putting a foreigner in charge of that force, and presumably it would be Stilwell. Now he wants greater lend-lease. One of the prices he's asked for in return for saying bygones are bygones in relation to Buccaneer is a $1 billion loan from the Americans, and he wants even more. So there's all this tension that's kind of coming to a head by the time we get to September. And at the same time, it seems as though Roosevelt and George Marshall have kind of hit a wall with Chiang Kai-shek in terms of all these other issues that we've discussed. And so they send this very sharply worded telegram to this message to Chiang Kai-shek, basically like, get your act together. We've suggested you do this and this and this. And this is all reacting, of course, by the way, to the massive Japanese offensive in China, which is like, so central to this whole discussion, because it seemed as though Chiang Kai-shek's government might collapse and the operations in Burma be meaningless. And it's all this, and not to mention the Japanese campaign against Imphal and Kohima and all that. So there's all these balls in the air. And Stilwell is so excited that the American government is finally going to speak sharply to Chiang Kai-shek. And this is a window into Stilwell's character. As honest as he is on many levels, he's also quite venomous, hence his name, but he's also kind of vindictive, and he hates Chiang Kai-shek so much that he likes the idea of, harpooning him, as he will put it. And so he gets to sort of vent his spleen, but it really is self-defeating, because Chiang Kai-shek says, all right, I'm done with you. You're no longer welcome in China. And so then he backtracks on this whole thing of putting an American in charge of that military force. The whole lend-lease thing is messy still, and it's just a total mess. So Stilwell is sent home quite anonymously in the fall of 1944. He's promoted to 4-star, but sent home, and he's told to just basically gag order. And the reason is we've got an election coming up in November. And the concern is that the China lobby, which tends to be very Republican, will gain a lot of momentum from the firing of Stilwell, and they'll really be able to put a dent in Roosevelt's reelection chances. So Stilwell goes home in a weird kind of dynamic, anonymously, as a kind of a sort of a failure, but kind of not too. He's done a lot of good stuff, and then eventually he's going to move on to other things. But most notably as Army Ground Forces, succeeding Leslie McNair, and then eventually commander of 10th Army. But Albert Wiedemeyer comes into play. He had, of course, been serving under Mountbatten, and he's made from much better diplomatic cloth in that regard. So he has a much better relationship with Chiang Kai-shek, which is now in play by the end of 44. But he has the same exact reform ideas as Stilwell that are never really truly implemented. And so his big thing, once we have the road open especially, is he wants to prepare a major Chinese offensive to recapture the Chinese port cities that we've lost earlier in the war. That is a major reason why China is out of touch with its allies. So this is his preoccupation throughout much of 1945. And of course, events elsewhere overtake that effort. But there's no question Albert Wiedemeyer has a better relationship with Chiang Kai-shek. But unfortunately, it doesn't really equate to better strategic results of the sort we would want and need. And he will eventually become, kind of political in his retirement, blaming a lot of the problems on Stilwell, which I think is kind of unfair to an extent. I mean, I think it's this whole issue is one of these things that it's very hard to just sort of fly by comment on it. It's easy to make political points out of it in the American electoral context, especially the feverish anti-communism of the 50s and the 60s. It's harder to actually really know what's going on. It's a Byzantine dynamic in the theater with all these cobwebs and all this kind of different moving parts. And so I think it's easy to caricature and not all that easy to really understand the sort of complexities and nuances of it that we're trying to kind of butt up against here. So Stilwell is a bit of a tragic character, I think. His failure is America's failure ultimately, and we're paying the price for that. But I also think he did on some levels the very best he could, and he was so dedicated. But he had these character flaws that just were the worst thing that we could have at that moment in time. We really needed a kind of an Eisenhower in theater, but he already had a job, and So it's just one of those historical realities, I guess.
No, I want to bring Rob in, but I'm not going to bring Rob in because we've just got a few minutes of you left, John. So I just want to, the Stilwell going back home. Another thing I think is, of course, by the time you get to 1945, there's a lot going on for the Americans elsewhere in that hemisphere, and you've got Okinawa and the Philippines. But does, in some ways, both the American public and to some extent the American government sort of start losing interest when it gets into 1945? Is 44 the last year that the people are really paying attention to Burma campaign? I think the same can apply to the British as well. But does that make sense to you, John?
It just, I mean, the whole China, Burma, India thing, or just China now, whatever it is. I mean, it's just sort of backbench behind these other big stories that are happening globally, and we are fighting a global war that I would argue no country, kingdom, whatever, ever had anything like this in prior human history, and probably hasn't had ever since on some levels. And so there's a lot to deal with. And some pretty complex issues too, and the sort of nightmare scenario that American policymakers are thinking about in 1945 is that we could actually invade the home islands and defeat the Japanese there, but they could have a rump state continue in Manchuria, the Kwantung Army, and portions of China, and we're kind of concerned about that. So, but it's one of many issues, that are in play, and especially Truman is going to have to deal with a lot of this too. But so Stilwell ends up, of course, always associated with China, but really wanted to reinvent himself, and I think that's what's interesting too. Yeah, he's got Army ground forces for a while, and he does fine, but that's not his gig. He's been there as a theater commander, and he wants back in the game. So he's willing, though, to come back into play as an army commander. As I said, he eventually succeeds General Buckner, who's killed in the Battle of Okinawa. Initially, General Geiger, the Marine general, was going to have 10th Army for a short time, but Stilwell, a long period. And so if we had invaded the Japanese home islands, 10th Army might have had some kind of involvement in that as a reserve and follow-on force. And Stilwell was totally happy with that because, in a way, he always wanted a ground combat command, and his CBI command hadn't quite been that. So it had to be a diplomat, a strategist, and not that he couldn't do that, because I think Stilwell was misunderstood that his really kind of waspish nature negated his ability for diplomacy. I don't think that's 100% true, but I do think that it could be a liability under certain circumstances that we unfortunately saw. While taking into account we know Chiang Kai-shek's warts. We do. But I think we know a lot more about him now in the 21st century than we did 30 or 40 years ago, especially with the availability of his diary. And I hope, like Rob had said, that we have maybe a little bit more of a China-centered analysis of all this, and we think about how the Chinese lost their lives in this war, 15 million plus or something. I mean, Americans can't even begin to get their mind around that. And I could almost guarantee if I walked out on the street today, 98 out of 100 of my countrymen and women would have no idea that, and may not even know that China was in World War II, or that we were by the way. But now come to think of it, but so what chance is there really for a good understanding then in that context, I guess? But
to be, before we do lose you, just to kind of be optimistic for the future. I mean, the USA much more multicultural now. You've got obviously lots of Chinese Americans and Taiwanese Americans, Vietnamese Americans, African American Americans. Theoretically, the next generation of historians will come at this theater from a more multicultural background, rather than kind of the U.S. Marine centric way that World War II in that theater has been written about back in the 50s and 60s. So I'm hoping that you're confident for the future that a more a wider lens will be put on that theater.
Yeah, really, I hope so, because it is America is better in the sense that it's more diverse now, and maybe a little more tolerant and whatever. But it might take a really good Chinese American scholar to create a new kind of historiography for us on this. And one example I'd give is an amazing scholar of the Vietnam War, who herself has a Vietnamese background, Professor Nguyen. I mean, she can bring a level of understanding to this that I think many of the rest of us just really can't. And so I hope there's something like that. And I'm not saying there's no great work or whatever, but in terms of our popular memory, and our cultural understanding, I don't think it's very high. And I think that's a shame, because these things really matter, because I think we'd all agree that our relations with the People's Republic of China in the world situation and geopolitical situation in that regard is of prominent importance, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of this goes back many, many years, not just to World War II, but before that, for all of us, obviously. That if we have no knowledge of that here in the U.S., then that's an issue, I think.
Well, John, we will leave you there. We will let you go, and we will bring Rob in to kind of address what you were saying there about that. But it's been, John, as always, wonderful to talk to you. If I don't speak to you before, happy Christmas, and we will reconvene again on World War II TV, and if not, we'll reconvene somewhere else. But John, thank you very much for your contributions. We'll
Bye,
let
John.
you go.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
a pleasure.
Bye-bye. So,
Bye.
Rob, let's bring you in. We've said goodbye. So to react from what John said there about going back to the question I asked John about the projections for 1944, did it go to kind of plan? What were the aspirations for 1945? But from the British kind of, and we haven't mentioned Slim yet. We're an hour in. I don't think he's come up at all. We mentioned Mountbatten.
No, that's very remiss of us. Just a couple of things. I love John's input there. A couple of things to say. The first is, the Americans were involved in China in large part because of their own cultural imperatives. Missionary imperatives, which Roosevelt accepted. He described them as missionary imperatives. Roosevelt's great-great-grandfather had gone out to China and made $1 million in the 1820s. And much of Roosevelt's intuitive support of China came from America's relationship with China that went back, well over 100 years. We need to remember that. But, and people criticize Stilwell, and it's very easy to criticize Stilwell, but actually behind what Stilwell was doing, there was another man who was primarily to blame for leading Chiang Kai-shek astray, and that's Claude Chennault. Claude Chennault was the head of the 14th Air Force, and American, over-promoted. He retired from the American Air Force before the war as a colonel, was then brought in to command the volunteer guard, the AVG that protected the Burma Road. And he was then promoted to Major General. I mean, Stilwell's diary comment when Chennault was promoted was absolutely crazy. But we need to remember that Claude Chennault, an airman, deeply imbibed the air power theories of the 1920s, which argued that the bomber would always get through, and the bomber was the solution to defeating the Japanese. Drip-fed these ideas into Chiang Kai-shek's ear. And Chiang Kai-shek went along to all these conferences with Churchill and Roosevelt and said, I need more aircraft, I need bombers, and we can take the war to Japan from China. So we need to remember that there were two competing theories of how to defeat the Japanese. One, which John has described as the Pacific Campaign. Actually, Mountbatten and Churchill all said the island hopping campaign is the way to get to the home islands. That's the way to do it. Don't go through China. We already know that China is deeply problematic. The Japanese are in China, and as soon as the Claude Chennault's arguments gained a little bit of ground, Chiang Kai-shek was given more aircraft. He built some more bases for his bombers. And in August 1944, the Japanese launched a massive offensive against them called the Ichigo Offensive, August 1944, and overran most of them. But the whole idea that Claude Chennault had, I think, was deeply, deeply flawed, and he wasn't called out for it. He was also a much better communicator than Stilwell. There's a wonderful story of John Dill, General Sir John Dill, and General Arnold, and Claude Chennault, and Stilwell, and a number of others flying all the way to Kunming. In fact, on that flight, Arnold and Dill, their plane very nearly didn't get there because they got lost. I mean, they landed, on the with a few gallons of fuel left in the aircraft. Anyway, the story is, Stilwell sat in his hand and sort of grumped his way through the meeting because he was a very poor communicator, whereas Claude Chennault got up there, very articulate, described how bombers were going to win the war, and won everyone over, apart from John Dill and Arnold and so on. That's just by means of background. You asked the question about what ambitions people had about the strategic dimension, how we were going to go into 1945 and defeat the Japanese. Well, the strategic conversation through 1943 was deeply chaotic, and it was prejudiced, or it was biased. Sorry, there were lots and lots of plans for 1943 and early 1944. None of them came to fruition because of the pressure on getting amphibious equipment and so on to Europe. The Europe first, the Germany first, defeated Germany first policy determined everything else. So basically what happened in the war in the Far East, not the war in the Pacific, but the war in the Far East, and what we call the Burma Campaign, was basically a make do and mend strategy. If we couldn't achieve what we wanted strategically, we would just do what we could. Let me say that although the plan that was agreed in 1943 to converge into Upper Burma was a plan to secure the Burma Road, that's really what it was about, and not to throw the Japanese out of Burma. What happened at the end of 1944, as a consequence of the tremendous victories that Bill Slim and the 14th Army had achieved at Kohima and Imphal, enabled the 14th Army then to follow the coattails of the defeated Japanese 15th Army into Burma and manage operations in Burma in 1945 such that the Japanese were defeated. They weren't planned at all. In June 1944, the Battle of Kohima had just been won, although London didn't know anything about that at the time. They were all desperately concerned the Japanese were still going to win. The Japanese had been massively defeated. About 80% of Motoguchi's 100,000 man army had been destroyed. I mean, when I say destroyed, killed. And it was a serious defeat for the Japanese. But there was no plan to reconquer Burma. No plan whatsoever. The only plan to operate troops in Burma were the Chindits on the basis of the plan that I described, Yunnan force coming in from China and so on. The plans that actually came to fruition in 1945 came not by accident, not by strategic determination, but by the idea of Bill Slim to chase the defeated 15th Army, Motoguchi Ren's army, into Burma, across the Chinwal into Burma. And in June 1944, he had a conversation with Mountbatten. Interestingly enough, General Sir George Gifford was above him, and then Oliver Leese later in 1944 as the Allied Land Forces commander. But Slim had a really powerful relationship with Mountbatten. And a conversation took place by letter in which Slim said, look, you really need to give me permission just to follow up the 15th Army, because I think if we follow into Burma, we could cause them some immense destruction. Mountbatten knew that Churchill didn't want to jump into Burma. He described fighting in Burma as akin to jumping in the sea to wrestle with a shark. Why would anyone be so stupid as to do that? Burma was jungle, and Burma was 1942. Burma was defeat. Burma was everything that was awful about fighting the Japanese. But Slim said, no, we've moved on from that. Anyway, to cut a long story short, Slim was given permission to follow the 15th Army into Burma. And by the time the rain stops, the monsoon, May till October, by the time the rain to stop, the wonderful the 5th Indian Division had cleared the route to the Chinwin. And the 19th in December 1944, the 19th Indian Division under Pete Reeves crossed the Chinwin and made its way towards Mandalay, and realized as they were cracking on, within 2 weeks, they realized that there were no Japanese in Upper Burma. This was actually going to be a campaign they could win. And from that, Slim created a plan to defeat the Japanese in Burma in 45. So not by accident, but not by strategic determination either. And our wars are often like that. I mean, it's important, given my point earlier about the importance of strategy, how strategy is important. Actually, in 1945, it demonstrated how battle led strategy. Winning a battle can determine your strategy. And that sometimes happens as well.
Well, I'm going to bring in Jack on Bill Slim, because it's incredibly important to this theatre. Every single time there's a conversation on any of my subjects on World War II TV, and people talk about the best generals of World War II, Slim's name always comes up. And basically, once he does, that kind of feels it's a mic drop moment for you. People kind of go, "Yeah, no, you won on that." Jack, is he as important as we all think he is? I mean, from your point of view of writing about the battles?
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, and obviously Rob's touched on this quite heavily there. He makes a series of decisions through 1944 and into 1945 that are absolutely crucial to the ultimate outcome of the whole thing. His decision when the monsoon comes after the battles of Imphal and Kohima, when the Japanese 15th Army is at its absolute weakest, 30,000 wounded, 23,000 dead, and so on. These are huge numbers for what was a 3-division operation. And his decision to then chase them out of the Imphal plain, down the really tortuous mountainous Chin Hills, through the thick jungle, through a monsoon. Normally the operational wisdom would be that you spend the monsoon spending the time to retrain your forces, regroup, rebuild, and then strike back with your decisive force the following year. Slim's decision is built on the fact that if he leaves the Japanese to do that in the Chin Hills, there will be a far more difficult opposition to destroy. If he allows them to recover during the monsoon in those Chin Hills, it will be a much more bloody operation to then get to Burma, to then liberate Burma from them. And so that's decision number one. The other big thing, and a huge argument of sort of my research, is it's worth remembering that Burma is not just monsoon and jungle. So sure, the monsoon.
It's been coming up in the sidebar the last 5 minutes. Yeah.
This is a huge part of this. Imphal's at the Battle of Imphal, Slim's decision to retreat to the Imphal plain is partly because he intends to use his superior firepower, the ability to send reinforcements quickly to where the Japanese pressure is greatest. Is all predicated on the fact that he can use the open plain much more easily. And again, by pushing them out of the Japanese out of the Chin Hills when they're at their weakest, enables the campaign of 1945 to take place. And obviously this massively relies on other events. We've mentioned Arakan and the fact that, what the British essentially wanted to do originally was amphibious hooks to get to Rangoon, not even bother fighting, the fighting a shark in the water kind of thing. And Lucy Betcher Dyson's obviously got a book coming out next year about the Arakan campaigns that were about getting the aerial research, the airfields ready to resupply the 1945 campaign, because they wouldn't be able to, once they're beyond the Irrawaddy, it's beyond sort of the economical range of the C-47 and C-46s that are going to supply these operations. But again, once they're through the Chin Hills and, they've got that aerial capability from taking Akyab Island, Ramri Island, and so on in Arakan, when they strike across into central Burma, again, Slim is choosing to fight this army-scale battle, not companies and battalion patrol work that's happening in the jungle before this point. This is about taking your army side or corps-sized battles and defeating the Japanese in place. Don't let them withdraw. Don't let them regroup. That's why they do the operations that they do, and also why they change their plans. From Operation Capital, which is the initial plan when they break into northern Burma, and then extend it to capture Rangoon. By destroying the Japanese army in that central plain, which is like a desert-like Salisbury Plain, essentially. And again, and going back to my books and so on, it's significant about the use of armor in particular. The Thunder Run to Mektila is my second book is titled that. That's where where that's going for, the use of armor in mobile columns on this almost desert-like plain and destroying the Japanese there, so that whatever happens next, and if that's the race to Rangoon, which is essentially what they're driving for, then they will have a much easier time. And frankly, that comes to pass. And these are all decisions that Slim has made operationally, not entirely on his own, but he's the driving character behind this. And that's why, again, he's become that almost like that purist's choice of the greatest general of the British.
And yet, although we acknowledge how brilliant he was, we also have this idea, I mentioned it earlier, that the Burma campaign is all these kind of single columns pushing up jungle tracks idea, when, as you just said yourself there, Jack, it's actually his ability to bring in corps and fight what our mutual friend James Holland would call big war, is really more what he's trying to bring to this theatre, more so than, and we had questions in the sidebar about how effective really were the Merrill's Marauders campaigns and the Chindia operations in 44, which we can maybe address. But Rob, to bring you in on this, is this idea that Slim is actually very good big war. Is that something we don't think about enough?
It's absolutely something we don't consider well enough. I would start by just describing Slim as being the full-orbed general. By that I mean he was able to think big, and he was able to understand what was necessary to defeat the Japanese. He was a strategic thinker. He was very lucky. Let me say that right at the outset. He had a good relationship with Mountbatten. Mountbatten came out in October 1943. Slim was appointed to command the 14th Army, and he had a big idea about defeating the Japanese in India, when by December 1943 it was obvious that Japanese were coming into India. So he was able to think strategically. He was able to think operationally. He came up with a bold plan to defeat the Japanese that no one else countenanced, no one else supported, but Mountbatten supported. The Indian Army headquarters in Delhi, GHQ Delhi, didn't like the idea, Slim's idea of withdrawing from the Chinwan, withdrawing to a defensive perimeter effectively around Imphal. And it was bold, but the political idea of retreating wasn't widely accepted. But Slim knew by that stage that the troops he had trained through 1943 were up to it. They were up to defeating the Japanese and so on. And then this idea of chasing the Japanese back into Burma was Slim's idea. If you look at all the decisions, I did this many years ago, you list all of the decisions from the official history about the campaigns that were ultimately successful, not the campaigns that were planned and didn't happen, but the plans that were ultimately successful, many of them which hadn't been planned. The one person behind them all in every single case was Bill Slim. And if you take Bill Slim out of the equation, you do not have success in Burma. And it's really as simple as that. The Allies were very, very lucky to have Bill Slim in place in 1943 and 44, because he was able to think about defeating the Japanese. He was able to execute his plan in 1944 and defeat them. That's both the Battle of the Box, the Admin Box in Arakan, and also Kohima and Imphal. He was then able to follow up, create a plan that would decisively discombobulate General Kimura, the new commander of the Japanese area army, and outshine him and defeat the armies in the field. So if you're looking at Slim, why do we go on about Slim? It's very rare to get a general who's able to think strategically, operate brilliantly at the operational level of war, the campaign level of war, deploy his armies in a way in which the enemy can be defeated, and keep the men on side at the same time. It's very, very rare. Those sort of people are very rare when it comes to generalship. When you look at the way in which soldiers voluntarily supported Slim, and when I say soldiers from right across the empire, more than 87% of the fighting troops in Burma, of course, were Indian, and they adored Bill Slim. They called him Uncle Bill. The Uncle Bill, the Cha-Cha Slim Saab, as Hindustani for uncle, was not an English phrase. It was an Indian phrase. And they were prepared to fight with him against the Japanese in a way that's very, very unusual in warfare. I mean, let's just put this in context. Montgomery had nothing of the charisma, of the earthy charisma of Bill Slim.
You set the benchmark quite low with Montgomery, though, Rob.
Well, I was going to go and say, of course, there are lots of generals who did have that. But actually, look, in the Second World War, I mean, dear old Al Murray makes this point very clear. You look at all those generals in the British Army, there were very few that were earthy soldiers. I mean, hardly any of them. In fact, Bill Slim was probably the standout general. You have to go back to the Duke of Marlborough, in my mind, and beyond that to Cromwell, to get an earthy commander who was able to secure the loyalty of his soldiers and fight battles, win campaigns, and think strategically. Those four things in tandem, it's the holy grail of generalship. And Bill Slim had it. Monty didn't. Bill Slim had it.
Well, so we will begin to wind things up now. And, the whole point of this was to kind of put Burma in the context of 1944 and also where we are in the historiography that John mentioned earlier. And so, before we went live, we talked about the fact that you said that you still maintain that Burma is the forgotten war. And the sort of tragedy, perhaps these are not the right word, but 85% of the people that did love Bill Slim, as the point you made there, went back to West Africa and India and what's now Pakistan and didn't write their memoirs. And if they did, they didn't write them in English. And so, whereas all the people who'd served under Montgomery pretty much did go back to Britain and Canada and those places there, and at least he was talked about. I mean, you were part of the BBC's VJ Day coverage, when that was happening. Where are we in understanding 1944 in the Burma campaign? As I said earlier, we've got the Kohima, the Imphaals, the admin box, of these kind of high points that are recognized by some of the public, but are they in some ways distractions for the real takeaways we should be taking from 44? What is, to sum up my point, what is the takeaway from 1944 we should be looking at, Rob? And then we're going to Jack.
Okay. Well, we've made slight progress, but it's very, 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 very minor progress. I would say that within the community of people who think seriously about the Second World War as an academic subject and as a subject of historical interest, we have made good progress. Those people who have been preaching the 14th Army and the Burma Campaign over the last 30 years. But in the wider British community and across the Commonwealth, I don't think we've made any progress at all. And I'm not entirely sure why that's the case, although there are a number of us out there banging the drum. The war is still misunderstood and viewed with quite distinct prejudice. There's a whole series of additional things that have come in really in the last 5 or 7 years about the nature of colonialism and its impact on the agency of individuals. And so the question is, why did an Indian in the 1940s join the British Indian Army? Well, you've heard me on the subject before. That still rears its head and it still needs to be discussed. But in many respects, we've got people out there, Jack and I, for instance, who are talking about it, which is good. But in terms of an academic subject, no, we are a long, long way from raising the interest of the 14th Army and the war in Southeast Asia to anywhere remotely like the levels of interest that exist for other theatres of war. And you are right. The reason for that is because is that 87% of the fighting troops in the 14th Army were Indian, and it's not part of the Indian view of its history.
Yeah,
there are parts of the Indian historical fraternity who do accept it, but actually, in terms of popular culture, it doesn't exist, and that's the real challenge. And it just raises the bar for all of us who are trying to explain that this was an Indian victory and it needs to be recognized by India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh as part of their history. It's just not colonial history. Together, they defeated Japanese imperialism, totalitarianism, and they should be proud of it. They were on the right side of history. That's the message that still needs to be got out there. I don't think we're going to win the battle, but it's worth fighting.
No, a good point. I'll bring in Jack in a second. But yeah, you're right. I mean, to confront this theatre properly, we have to address empire and colonialism and racism and all those difficult subjects that aren't ones that we're comfortable. And so, Jack, you were out last night talking about your book, but to be kind of devil's advocate for your your work is brilliant. But are people coming to listen to you because it's a brilliant, cool story about tanks primarily? Or is it because there is a renewed interest in the Burma campaign? Or is it a bit of both? I would hope it's a bit of both.
I think it probably is a little bit of both. And I think, and just sort of going to Rob's point as well, is I think that colonial issue is also something that means that a lot of people don't want to touch it. In sort of the mainstream side of it. They just don't want to get caught up in any sort of potential arguments, the wrong things said that turns into some sort of viral scandal or something like that. And so there's an inherent caution, I think, amongst more mainstream sort of outlets of history that means that they don't want to go there. But I think that also linked to that is the way that, the whole point, we talked about this earlier when John was with us as well. This is a theatre that is not a threat, an existential threat to Britain, to the United States. It is to China, but that, they do treat their war with Japan in a much more serious way. So the Burma theatre is, and that's really me driving to why it's the forgotten theatre. It was forgotten at the time because it was so far away, and it's so far away now in that very literal sense. And what I think is really, really sad about it is that they're also just really amazing stories. They actually should be an opportunity for us to talk about colonialism. People shouldn't be so shy of that. And I think that there's almost faddishness around that. You know, people want to performatively say and point out, oh, well, of course, the British Indian Army was just a colonial, you know, oh, they weren't volunteers really, you know, and there's a lot of that, you know, their socioeconomic background is why they all joined the army, when actually, you know, that takes away the agency of the Indian individual, and actually I think is sometimes a slightly condescending sort of attitude to have.
Yeah.
Actually, they're very aware of what's going on in China and what Japanese colonialism, because that's what they are. That's the alternative. It's not Indian independence. It's Japanese colonialism replacing British colonialism. And they, you know, the rape of Nanking is front page news in India. And that is far more recent than anything that the British have done. And I think that's a very and a very important part of that. And I think actually that these are arguments worth having. You know, like Rob said, is actually we should be having these conversations, even if it's not necessarily a war that we're going to win. I think there's battles that we can win, though, certainly. And actually, I think what we should try and do is you just have to keep talking about it, because people turn up to these things. You know, people come up to hear both of us talk. Lots of people are very excited about the work that Rob and I are about to start with the Forgotten War pod, you know, and there are lots of people fantastic that are watching this right now. You know, it's a battle worth having.
Yeah, well, I mean, if it's the rewards come for tackling complicated subjects. I mean, that's it, but you have to work at it. You know, there's no easy answers to this. It isn't. You can't just pick up a 20-page, you know, pamphlet or read a Wikipedia entry and feel you've mastered this campaign. You know, Rob has been at it for a lifetime. Jack, less, but it's become a major part of your life these last few years. And there are no simple answers. And I'm sure, you know, we've talked about before, Rob. I mean, your understanding and thinking about this is obviously evolving, because the situation in the Far East has evolved considerably since you began to write about this campaign and China's prominence today that perhaps wasn't there 30 years ago. So it's not only a conversation rooted in the past, it's a conversation, you said this yourself, Rob, that is about today as well. And there are multiple threads to it and multiple strands, and it is complicated. But to end things on a positive way, Darren Little is saying, just to say, chaps, I'm thoroughly looking forward to your Forgotten War podcast coming up in Feb next year. Can't wait for Arakan 45 stories campaigns, especially the Commandos ones, of course. All the best. So, you know, just to end off things, you've got a Blue Sky account, you've got a Twitter account. You've started recording the pods, but where can people find out more about it so that they can get prepared for? Because February's not far away now. It's only 7 weeks or something.
Well, you're gonna panic me now. We've done the rehearsal. We've written quite a few of the episodes, but there's a lot of work to do, Jack, over Christmas.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the thing. There is a lot of content that we're putting together at the moment, and that you know, we've got a few teaser things that are going to come out over the next couple of weeks and months as well. We've got to formalise the final recordings as well. You know, but yeah, you can catch us where all of our social media is at Forgotten War Pod. And we also have a Gmail account, which we're about to announce formally next week. But, you know, for anyone, because we are going to do some question and answer episodes towards the end of the first series, because we're going to do it as a series thing initially, certainly, so that we can do, you know, 12, 13, 14 weeks. Then, you know, there'll be a bit of a break and things like, and then do another series a couple of months later. But we want to encourage people to send questions. So we also have forgottenwarpod@gmail.com. if anyone wants those. But obviously content on that won't be coming out until April, May. So
right, okay. Well,
it'll be towards the end of series 1 that they actually get answered. Just so
well, as you have said during this conversation, John, earlier, is there's plenty to talk about when it comes to Burma. So it's not like you're going to be running out of ideas after a first series. So you're maybe biting off more than you can chew. But let's hope in a few years' time we're celebrating your 150th podcast and you're up there in the top ranks of podcasts, because it's a subject that I find it intriguing. Although I'm not as knowledgeable as you guys there. And again, I want to thank you for your books and John for his books, because they are must-haves in coming to terms with this campaign. But we will bring things to an end now. Folks, I'm back twice tomorrow. We've got Blue Jerusalem is a show tomorrow morning or evening if you're in the USA. Then we've got another show in the evening with Rick Green, who's in the audience, talking about this theatre, but a different story about Canadians involved over there. So I'm looking forward to those two shows. But thank you, as always, viewers, for your fantastic questions. No time to really get to your sidebar questions, otherwise we'd be here in another 2 hours' time. But thank you, Jack. Thank you, Rob. Thank you to the departed John McManus. It's been a delight talking to you. I will see you all again tomorrow. Thanks very much. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.